Alright, I know in my last video we talked about a stasis build, but we're going back to talking about Sentinel Titan after some top Destiny content creators recently talked about it. I think they did a good job of starting the discussion, but I want to highlight what I think is the true heart of the problem for that 0.1% chance that Bungie may hear this and give the subclass some love. To start, let's go over Aegis, Above, and Saltagreppo's tier list video, specifically their portion on Sentinel Titan. And to clarify, this will be focusing on PvE Void Titan, not PvP. I think Castle Content already did a great breakdown of that category, link in the description. Now, ultimately, Aegis, Above, and Saltagreppo landed with B tier for PvE Void Titan, but Salt originally put it in low S. Why is that? Let's roll the tape.
Void Titan.
Ooh.
I'm very curious to see where you guys land on this one.
For me, it's low S. HoiL is still unbelievably crazy with it, so if you want to like clear a room without going in, spamming like vortex grenades like crazy, it's very good.
Yeah,
They
is
also
that more
just
the
gave
subclass, or is that the exotic that's doing that? I feel
it's
like
the exotic. It's definitely the exotic.
Above said it perfectly. Is that the subclass or the exotic? In these moments, we have to remember the wise words of Tony Stark. If you're nothing without it, you shouldn't have it. No subclass should need to rely on an exotic just to feel usable. Now we can deduce that Salt uses HoiL when he's on Sentinel Titan, but what does he say to Above's next question?
how often do you play it relative to Bonk or Berserker?
I mean, nowadays I played it in a run, and I was like, fuck me, why did I play this compared to Bonk?
And when people bring up Void Overshields and its damage resist, I think Salt summarizes this pretty well.
And
about
you
you,
have people thinking, oh, the Void Overshield gives DR. That's just not how it works. Like, it's just DR to the Overshield. As soon as it breaks, or if you get hit by something hard, you are gonna take that damage.
Yeah.
It's not like it gives DR to your health, right?
Yeah.
So
And that
the
Overshield
Void
is, like,
Overshield is
paper
pretty
thin.
weak.
Yeah.
It's better to just think of it as an overshield and not something that gives you damage resist, because once the overshield is gone, you lose the resist, of course. And people think, oh, 50% damage resist, that's great, but that's only providing 50% on top of 45 HP, which only equates to a total 67.5 HP. It's surprisingly weak in in-game PvE content. We'll get to the utility Void Overshield brings in a minute, but just wanted to highlight how weak it is. This brings Aegis to this conclusion.
But I think even with HoiL, even with one of the strongest ability spam exotics in the game, even when HoiL was pre-nerf, right? It's just like the ability spam is just not as potent as most of the upper half of this tier list, right? Especially in today's state. And with post-nerf HoiL, the uptime is even worse now. So even with Offensive Bulwark boosting your ability regen, I think the defensive utility is kind of there, and I think the offensive utility is really not there. And of course, okay, also
not there at all.
one more thing.
right?
Bungie, revert the bubble nerf. Okay, why did you make it 25%? Why? Just why?
We're going to come back to this, but Aegis mentions that the ability spam is just not as potent as the top options, even when HoiL was pre-nerf, and even with Offensive Bulwark's regen, and that though it may have some defensive qualities, its offensive capabilities really leave a lot to be desired. But let's talk about the super options real quick, and respond to Aegis about the bubble nerf. Now, I don't work at Bungie, nor claim to know what they're thinking, but I have to imagine that the nerf to bubble was to 1. Limit its power in PvP on a tier 5 super cooldown, since the nerf happened alongside the separation of Banner Shield and Bubble, and 2. To remove the well/bubble PvE damage meta. This meta forced both Warlocks and Titans into one option for damage phases. When you have 29 super/variants in the game, that is just not healthy. But you say that Well is still in the game and that Warlocks have 9 super options? Don't worry, I'm getting to that. Above then talks about Banner Shield, stating,
So I think one class that could benefit from a huge buff would be Banner Shield maybe being shortened, but increased by like a substantial margin. Just give it a place in the sandbox, like whether it's for burst damage, like if you're going to rocket dump at the beginning of a DPS phase, like maybe bump it up to 100%, but only make it like 12 seconds instead of...
Above, I like where your head's at, but I think that's the wrong direction. As I mentioned, Well in its current state still forces Warlocks into using it, but that isn't healthy for the game, nor fun for Warlocks. Instead, Banner Shield need only be buffed from 40% to 45 to 50% to be an alternative to HoiL and still provide a full team of 6 with the same amount of total damage. This releases the grip in-game PvE has on Warlock, and lets Banner Shield has a use outside of GMs without being OP. Ultimately, all this talk leads Aegis and above to the final conclusion of...
So yeah, I would personally put Sentinel probably low A or high B. I'm leaning more towards high B, to be honest.
I agree.
And while I agree with this conclusion, I don't think it fully goes into why Sentinel is B tier. In addition to the issues that we've gone over, there's also the issue of the aspect dilemma. And you may have already noticed it in the background gameplay, as I don't have the aspect I'm about to mention. Sentinel Titan has no real ability loop outside of Offensive Bulwark, but only Bastion synergizes with it, but choosing that means you lose the offensive options of Controlled Demolition and the soon-to-be Unbreakable. You might say there's Echo Provision plus Echo of Exchange, but Echo of Exchange doesn't proc reliably with Controlled Demolition because if the Volatile gets the kill, it doesn't proc. And let's be honest, Shield Throw in its current state is nothing but an alternative way to apply Controlled Demolition at range because its damage is so bad, so you're really only feeding into melee with Echo of Provision with that combo. Sure, Shield Bash is an option, but extremely risky to use effectively in high-end PvE. The only other option is Devour, which gives a variable percentage of grenade energy on kills. Initially, I thought this was great, but then I realized that this forces you into a high-risk, high-reward gameplay, and while there's nothing wrong with that, unfortunately, Sentinel excels at support, not offense, like Aegis pointed out. Bubble, Banner Shield, Bastion, Controlled Demolition even, and the upcoming aspect Unbreakable all have features that are supportive. Sentinel Titan is just not a killing machine like Sunbreaker, Berserker, and Striker can be. To further highlight the issue with Sentinel Titan's lack of an ability loop outside of Offensive Bulwark, let's review all the aspects that Sentinel has and will have. We have 3 aspects plus 1 new upcoming aspect. Controlled Demolition, hitting an enemy with an ability or volatile explosion, cause them to become volatile. Volatile explosions near you, heal you, and nearby allies. Bastion, cast your barricade to grant a Void Overshield to you and nearby allies. Your barricade slowly fills you and allies with a Void Overshield while directly behind it. Casting your super also grants a Void Overshield to nearby allies. Offensive Bulwark, while you have a Void Overshield or inside a bubble, gain 400% grenade recharge rate, increased melee damage, increased melee range, melee final blows extend the duration of your Void Overshield. When paired with Controlled Demolition, your uncharged melee is now applied volatile, and you gain an additional shield throw while in Sentinel Super. And then Unbreakable. Consume your grenade to create a frontal shield that protects you and allies. This shield absorbs enemy attacks and the stored energy can be released back at enemies to damage them. You may think, okay, Offensive Bulwark is a perk monster, and you'd be correct, but this forces your hand to build into Void Overshields to get any benefit, and unfortunately, these can be somewhat of a pain to build into. Bastion is an option, but increases barricade cooldown and does nothing to increase your offensive capabilities. Shield Throw is an option, and has the potential to hit multiple targets for multiple chunks of Overshield, but severely suffers from wonky/bad tracking, as I've laid out in a previous video I've put in the description. It's best to only rely on the 15 HP Overshield and not 30 or 45. And relying on a 15 HP Overshield is just not reliable. Shield Bash requires putting yourself in harm's way by getting up close, and requires a kill, which is not always an option in high-end PvE. And getting that Overshield in any sort of close range method usually opens you up for retaliatory damage, which then is eaten to the Overshield you so desperately need just to make the subclass function. Lastly, there's Echo of Vigilance, but would you really rely on needing to kill a target while in critical health just to get your ability loop started? I didn't think so. And neither Controlled Demolition nor Unbreakable, from what we've seen, provides ability regen. So to reliably build into Void Overshield so that you can build into Offensive Bulwark just so that you can have some semblance of an ability loop, you're forced to look outside the subclass. That leaves us with no backup plans, which suffers from the same issues as Shield Bash, Helm of Saint 14, which is only usable with Bubble, Edge of Action, Vex Caliber, and Repulsor Brace. But again, I argue that no subclass should need an exotic or legendary perk just to feel usable. Okay, now that we've completely broken down the issues with Sentinel Titan, let's finally get into the fixes. But before we get into those, let's quickly shift focus to Datto's recent video about exotics that desperately need an update, specifically the portion where he covers Mask
of the Quiet One. Kills when you have no shield, heal you to full health, not health and shields, and taking damage restores a small amount of ability energy, about 5% on a 1-second internal cooldown. This is just an incredibly passive exotic with a weak effect in today's sandbox. 5% energy gains every time you're hit in lower tier stuff doesn't matter too much because there are exotics that allow you to do much more, and because you're in lower level content, you're never really in that much danger. Anyway, in endgame content, getting hit once or twice might just kill you outright, and the trade-off there is absolutely not worth it. Bungie could turn it into a Void exotic, or they could leave it neutral. If they were to buff it, what could they do? We have to think about what the identity of this exotic is, and I think most people correlate it with that ability to gain energy passively. However, receiving damage is something that is inherently passive. It's just something that happens to you. So we probably need to move away from the receiving damage portion of the exotic, or we keep it and we add something a bit more active to it as well. It was at this point in writing my script that I had an epiphany. I feel like this exotic may actually be better suited for the upcoming Titan aspect in Final Shape. Is literally designed around absorbing damage and then flinging it back at an enemy, which is the closest thing matching the vibe of this exotic. I could see a world where this exotic reduces how much damage you need to absorb to generate a full power blast back at your enemies. I could see it returning energy to you based on how much you absorbed or how much damage you dealt with that blowback, in addition to its current effect.
Datto, while I love where your head's at, I think you've gone about it the wrong way. While one aspect of the exotic's identity is receiving damage to receive a benefit, you're forgetting the part about generating health. I would argue that the exotic is more about a combination of both of these perks. Funny enough, we've already seen an alternative that provides this very perk combo of regaining HP and ability regen right here on Sentinel Titan. Void 2.0 and Forsaken brought Code of the Commander to Sentinel, and with it, the first iteration of Volatile. And with that, the ability to get HP and ability regen when Volatile exploded. Now, Bungie has already shown that they're capable of bringing old subclass perks back in the form of exotics. We need only look at Hallowfire Heart, which is now a combination of two old Sunbreaker perks, one from D1 and one from D2's Code of the Siegebreaker. If Bungie were to only change Mask of the Quiet One into an exotic that granted ability regen from volatile explosions with some sort of internal cooldown to knock it out of hand, this would already give an immense amount of gameplay / build variety to Sentinel. Controlled Demolition, Volatile rounds, Destabilizing rounds, and Unbreakable paired with Controlled Demolition would all benefit from this. And then for the HP gain, I would instead change that to little chunks of Void Overshield so that Controlled Demolition could also be paired with Offensive Bulwark for a more consistent Void Overshield uptime. This would also greatly improve the uncharged / charged melee interaction that happens when you pair Controlled Demolition and Offensive Bulwark, possibly even bringing it in line with the potency of Roaring Flames and Knockout. In addition, this would also not break PvP, since Volatile only explodes after 200 additional damage has been done after it has been applied. Now, I know this goes against my philosophy that a subclass shouldn't have an exotic if it can't stand on its own without it, so for that, we only need one simple tweak, and for that, I'll reference again my previous video. Shield Throw's reliability needs to shoot up. If it could just reliably and consistently hit 3 plus targets at that, this would allow base Sentinel to have a true third way of upkeeping full Void Overshield. Now, I wouldn't argue against more buffs to this ranged melee, but literally all Shield Throw needs to actually be useful is to reliably bounce to additional targets after the first one. Even if it was just half as good at bouncing as Threaded Spike, it would be a huge step up. Phew. Oh, you still there? Thanks for making it all the way here. That was a mouthful, to say the least. Clearly, I'm passionate about Titan. Yeah, there's no more script now, so thanks for making it this far. Please go and support the content creators that I mentioned, Aegis, Above, Saltagreppo, Datto, and Castle Content. They were great, huge help to making this. A lot of, I guess, research, I could say, went into this, just really highlighting. I just really wanted to highlight just all of the issues of Sentinel Titan, because I think it needs the most love. So thanks again for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed, and hopefully Bungie sees this, because Sentinel really needs some help. Alright, thanks. Bye.